So we have npm and Maven configured in Jenkins. So now we can actually create a job in order to run those commands. So either here directly as a create job or in new item, you can see a section to create a new job. Let's call it actually my job. So we just need to give it a name. And this is a list of types of jobs that we can create in Jenkins. The Freestyle project is the simplest one. This is basically for very simple workflows and maybe the easiest to start with. And this type of build can be used to test the application, to build it, even to push it to repository, etc. However, it is more simple and primitive compared to other types of jobs. So in practice, in the actual production use cases, you wouldn't be working with Freestyle project, but rather a pipeline job type. So we have a pipeline here, as you see, and we have multi-branch pipeline. And we're going to be using both of them to set up our complete CI/CD pipeline. However, these other three, we're not going to be covering them because pipeline and multi-branch pipeline are the ones that are used in most of the projects. So we're going to build our production-ready CI/CD pipelines with those two types. However, for the first simple use case, we're going to go with the Freestyle project and see that in action first. So I have selected this type and let's create a job from that. And the job was created and I'm in the configuration section. We have a bunch of checkboxes to configure here. We're just going to leave everything on default. We're going to scroll right to the build part and we're going to add a build step. And we're going to add execute shell. So this will actually allow us to execute normal shell commands, just like we would be executing them inside the Jenkins container command line. And since we have npm already available there, we're going to execute npm version. As for Maven, however, we cannot execute Maven commands here because we haven't installed Maven directly in the container. So we cannot execute it from execute shell window. As I said, this is just like Jenkins container command line, and we don't have Maven available there. However, in order to execute Maven, we have installed it as a plugin. So if I click here again, I see the plugin available right here. Invoke top-level Maven targets. So this will allow me to actually execute Maven commands. And you also saw we had Gradle and End available in our global configuration. Let's see that again. Tool configuration, we had Gradle and End, and therefore I have those plugins available as well. So all the tools that I have already configured, I can actually use right here. I haven't configured Gradle and End because they're not installed in Jenkins. However, I have installed Maven, so I can use it now. Maven version, this is the one that I have created. This is the name that I just gave it. And in goals, you can just pass in any command of Maven that you need. So I'm also going to do version and let's save it. And if I go to Jenkins main view, you see we have a list of jobs here. And inside every job, you actually have all of these options to configure your job, to delete the project, and also to build the project. So we're going to build a job. It was successful. And if you click inside a build, a specific build, you have some other option, one of them being console output. And here you see exactly what happened inside the job. So we executed npm version first, which is right here. npm version, this is the version that is installed in Jenkins. And through a plugin, we also executed Maven version, which you see right here. And this is the output of Maven version. And here you also see where this Maven tool actually got installed on Jenkins. This is the one that we mounted our volume to. So all the plugins, all the tools that we actually install through the UI in Jenkins end up in that folder as part of the Jenkins configuration. So the command gets executed from there. The npm, however, we installed in the whole container, so it is available as a command throughout Jenkins without using a plugin. Now, there are two things that I want to mention related to these build tools. First, let's go back to configure. And here you see the different executions for npm and Maven because we have installed them differently. So even though installing a tool directly on the server of Jenkins is a little bit more effort than installing it and configuring from plugin, it is much more flexible. Because here you see that the plugin gives you a UI with pre-configured input fields, etc., and some options. Here you need to configure them through input fields that this plugin provides you with, which can be limited depending on the plugin. However, if you want to script something using these commands, it is much more flexible to be able to use those commands directly as you would on the command line. So this is a difference between them. Another thing that I want to mention is how you can configure additional tools like Node.js, for example, which we don't have available right here through Jenkins UI. So in order for a tool to appear here, it needs to be installed through plugin first. So let's go to plugin section, available, and look up Node.js and install it. Successful. Now if I go back to tool configuration, here you see Node.js just got added. So for a tool to appear here, it needs to be installed first through a plugin. And once it is installed as a plugin, then it is available to be configured. So I don't have Node.js available yet in jobs. I cannot use it. So now I have to configure it to be able to use it. So add Node.js. And here you see a similar setup to Maven. We just give it a name. Node. Let's actually call it my Node.js without a version now. However, we're still choosing a version and install automatically from Node.js.org. So again, we're fetching it from internet instead of executing a command to fetch it. And if I save it and go back to my job, configure, and click on Add Build Step, now I have Execute Node.js script option, which was not there before. I installed the plugin. So as soon as I installed this here in the plugin section, this option got available. And if I click inside, I have this plugin view with all the inputs. And because I have configured it in tool configuration and actually added an installation, because of that, I have that installation actually available here. Otherwise, this would be empty and I would still not be able to use it, even though I have a plugin view for that. So if I choose it, here I can write the script, which is Node.js script itself. So you see that plugin UIs are different from each other. So here I just have option after Maven command. Here I can write a whole script. So this differ really based on the project. That's why I personally think it's more flexible and convenient to work with them directly as shell commands. So this is how you can configure any tool in your Jenkins for different jobs. So let's actually remove it because we don't need it and save the project again. So now we have a build that is executing two commands. However, it is not connected to any of our repositories, which is actually the whole sense of having a project to automate testing and building of a project, which is hosted on some Git repository. And if I go back inside the configuration view of my project, here is the tabs. This is the build tab that we have configured. And in the source code management tab, you see we have the option to configure Git repository. Now, as I mentioned, this freestyle job is the primitive or the most simplest type of job, and it can also be used for not repository related workflows. Therefore, I have this option here to choose none. So I'm not building anything from an existing repository. I'm just executing a certain task inside Jenkins. Because as I said, for automating most of the workflows and especially setting up a CI/CD pipeline, we don't do that with this freestyle job type, but rather with pipeline job types. So this could actually be used for some other simple scheduled jobs maybe that run regularly in Jenkins that has nothing to do with the repository. In this case, again, for demonstration, we're going to configure Git repository here. So when I click in Git, I get this view where I have option to configure repository URL so that Jenkins can connect to the repository. So I'm actually gonna take one of my projects. Here I have the URL. Let's copy the HTTPS URL. And this can be GitLab, GitHub, whatever Git repository you have, doesn't really matter. It's generic Git, it's platform neutral. So now we have a repository URL where Jenkins can actually connect to the repository. However, Jenkins will actually need to authenticate with the repository in order to clone and fetch that repository on its local file system, right? So we need to provide credentials to our Git repository. And this is where we configure that. However, we don't have any credentials in Jenkins yet. So we're gonna need to add one. And this is a pretty handy shortcut for adding credentials. If I click here, I have Jenkins credentials provider. And in here, I get a view to create a username password credential in Jenkins. So I'm going to enter my username and password from GitLab. I'm going to enter ID, GitLab credentials. This is going to be, so to say, the name of that credential that I can reference with. I don't need a description. And here you see the kind is username with password. And if I add, immediately I have it available in my list, so I can select it. So now I have credentials for this repository and I have repository URL. Down here we have a possibility to configure which branch we want to build. So you can build one specific branch, or as noted here, I can just leave it blank and this will match all the branches. And I can also specify multiple branches here. And if I save this, I have a job that is connected to a repository that could fetch the data from there. However, we're not doing anything with the data, right? We're just executing commands that are already installed in Jenkins. However, we're not doing anything from the repository itself. Let's actually still run it and see what happens. You see, it takes a little bit more time now because it needs to check out the code. And if I enter console here, you see some stuff happened. Git init, some Git commands got executed. The repository got fetched, configuration, options were set, and so on. So what happens is that whenever you have a job that is connected to a Git repository, it will actually check out that code locally in order to be able to run commands then against that repository. So if you're running tests, for example, it's gonna have the code, the latest code checked out locally, and then it will run the tests locally against that repository. And the same thing with build, it's gonna build the application locally. And the way this is structured is if we go back to Jenkins. So I'm on the server. If I do docker ps, I can actually enter the container -it. And here in var Jenkins home, this is where Jenkins stores all this data. And this is what we also persist on the droplet server. And here you see a bunch of different data that holds Jenkins configuration. Some of them being the plugins. We have the plugin configurations here. We have credentials here. and a bunch of other data. And here you see also a folder called jobs. And this is actually every time we create a job of whichever type it is, pipeline or freestyle or multi-branch pipeline, doesn't matter. All of them actually get created here, and each job gets a folder of the job name, and relevant data for that specific job gets stored there. So if we go inside that folder, you see we have builds. So this is basically a tracker of different builds of a job, and its information like logs, for example, the output that we see here, all of this is stored inside. Here you see we have the number of the build and some log files. Now in the older Jenkins versions, it was actually structured in a way that the Git checkout was also stored in the jobs folder. However, in the latest version of Jenkins, this changed, and the new destination is actually instead of jobs, it's in the workspace. And in workspace, you see I have 2 folders for my job. And if I check this one here, my job, I see the Git repository actually checked out locally here. This is exactly the repository files that I have in my project. So in master, I have pom.xml and this source folder. So this is where the Git repository is checked out in the latest Jenkins version. And let's also see the temp folder, which is empty for now, but this is to store some temporary data for the job until it completes. However, as I said, the job that we created is connected to Git repository, but it doesn't use anything from the repository. So let's actually go and change that. So if I go back to repository, I have created a Jenkins jobs branch. And here I have a simple shell script, freestyle build.sh. And here I am printing out npm version. So now let's go back to the job configuration. And here, first of all, in the branch specifier, let's actually specify the branch name Jenkins jobs instead of master, because I have my script file in this branch. And here, instead of executing npm version directly, we're going to execute a file in the repository. So when the repository is checked out, we're going to have this file locally on Jenkins, the freestyle build sh, and this means that we can run it like this. We can execute that script. However, before Jenkins will be able to execute it, we need to set permissions on that file, because otherwise Jenkins won't have an execute permission on it. So let's do change mod and add an execute permission to this file so that Jenkins user will be able to execute it. So let's save it and build. And if we check out the logs, here you see again a bunch of Git commands. And at this step, those 2 commands got executed. And here is the npm version. So this project, my job was just to showcase how to configure build tools and execute commands inside a job. So in the next part, we're going to take a Java Maven application. We're going to run tests from the project, and then we're going to build a jar file of that application. So now let's create a new freestyle job, and let's call it Java Maven build. In the configuration, we're going to build from Git. Copy Git URL. We have the credentials already, so let's choose it. The branch will be Jenkins jobs. And here in the build part, now we only need Maven because it's a Maven project. So I'm going to choose that plugin. And I'm going to execute Maven test. And then I'm going to execute Maven package command. And here in this branch, I actually have one super simple test that runs this here. It just initiates the application and tests one single function. So the test should run and the application jar should be created. So with this configuration, let's actually save it and run it. And it was pretty quick. In the console output, let's see what happened. Since this was the first build, it checked out the initial Git repository and initialized it. This is for the very first build. Here we see Maven test command got executed with all this output, and we have one test that ran. And here we have Maven package. Maven package actually also runs tests before packaging, so we see an output of tests again. And here all the dependencies got downloaded and installed in order to package the application into a jar file. So now if we go back to Jenkins server, var Jenkins home jobs, you see we have a new job that we created, and in the workspace we should see a new folder for Java Maven build as well. Let's check what's inside. And here you see the repository got checked out. These are all the files, and the target folder got created because we executed Maven package. And in the target folder, we should be able to see the jar file. And here is our jar file. So the application got tested and packaged as well.